This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a historian, the chair of the Holocaust Studies Program at the Western Galilee College in the north of Israel, and the author of a new book entitled Was Their Voice Heard? Early Holocaust Testimonies of Child Survivors, that was recently published only in Hebrew by Magnus Press. Dr. Boaz Cohen, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, Gilad.
Let's start by way of introduction with trying to map out the landscape a bit. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, were children treated as a separate category among the Holocaust survivors, the refugees, the DPs, etc.?
Yes, people understood that children are a separate entity, that there is to be policy towards children. People understood that you have to be aware of the problems of children. Actually, this can be seen both in the rebuilding of the Jewish communities, where even when there was no money for adults, funds were funneled to take care of children. You can see it in other nations as well. You can see it in the UNRWA work in the DP camps, where the child search section is very central to policies and activities concerning children. We're talking, actually in the world, we're talking probably millions of children, but at Europe at the time, children who were not at home, we're talking about hundreds of thousands.
By child search, you mean looking for their families for reunification?
So that's how it all started. Actually, when the Allies wanted to make sure that there will be no human catastrophe after the war, like there was after World War I with the flu epidemic with millions of dead, and they wanted to be prepared. For this reason, they established UNRWA. And the UNRWA had teams and policies.
Which stands for the
United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency. The idea was that every refugee should get home as soon as possible after he was fed, clothed, and taken care of medically. When these people arrive in Germany, they find out that there's close to 3 or 4 million slave laborers who have to get home, and concentration camps, inmates, etc., which they do very fast. In a few months, they send everyone home.
And not just Jews, by the way.
Not just Jews,
yeah.
not at all. Mm-hmm. The ones who are left over and the ones who don't want to go home, or after they come home, they return to Germany, are either Jews or Nazi collaborators.
Okay.
So the options are very... these are the people who have no home to come back to.
Right.
So now we have children in both communities, children of Polish people who are not collaborators, of course, but don't want to go back to communist Poland. So what you get is that several millions of DPs, of them we are talking about several 100,000 of Jewish DPs, in Germany mostly, also in Italy and Austria, and there are children.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is that out of the total population of Holocaust survivors, very few are children. I mean, very few of the children who entered the war, concentration camps, etc., managed to survive.
Yes, we're talking about the usual numbers, which are probably not accurate, but 11% of Jewish children survived the war. That's the population group which with the lowest survival rate in Jewish society. In Poland, we are talking 3%. Actually, when we talk about survivor children in the DP camps, many of them are actually refugees and not survivors. I mean, they survived the Holocaust by their parents being deported or escaping to the inner reaches of the Soviet Union.
But they weren't liberated from the camp.
There are hardly any children in the camps.
Mm-hmm. Because they just didn't survive. They were the first to go. Mm-hmm. So tell us a bit about the way that the relief agencies treated the children. You said that they realized that there was a special need for them. How did it translate into practice?
Well, you have these UNRWA teams. They have social workers, many women, American social workers, also from Britain, Jewish too. There you have national teams, or like Jewish, American, and British organizations sending A teams as well to work as UNRWA. You have Polish teams, etc. You have teams all around working. Very soon, it is quite obvious that both adults have to be housed separately, Jewish and non-Jewish, because the Jews are suffering anti-Semitism from the other DPs. But the children also have to be educated ethnically or nationally. So what you get is a whole system of DP children, they call them Kinderlager, children camps, most of which are organized according to national lines. I'm saying most of because not all. They are organized according to national lines. And UNRWA is working with the national agencies. Actually, this is a policy decision to work with the national groups and not to
try to reintegrate them into their respective nations, into their respective societies?
Again, the DPs in Germany are the ones who don't want to integrate back into their societies. They have no societies to integrate into. They want to stay. And their children, they want their children educated ethnically, nationally. Mm-hmm. And
so in the case of Jews, it means Zionism? Not
only, but very much so. I mean, what we see... first of all, we must accept that Zionism was scored, unfortunately, a major victory after the Holocaust. I mean, at least officially and vocally, Jewish survivors wanted to go to Palestine. This is not to say that they all went to Palestine, but officially this was the DP stand, and they wanted to go to Palestine, and they were not accepting any other option, and no one offered them any option. Yeah. So actually what we see is that most of them get to Israel in the end, but big numbers go to the U.S. when it opens its gates later on.
Mm-hmm. How did the national education work in these terms, in this context?
I'm really interested in the real early days. In the real early days, the story doesn't start in the DP camps, it starts in Poland and all over Europe, where Jews organize privately to take care of the children. What you see in these groups is that they are organized by survivors themselves. This idea of this big mission from Eretz Israel coming to the DP camps and educating the children is not representative of the first years after the Holocaust. The people who do this Zionist education are themselves people who lost everything in the war. So actually, my last research that was just accepted for publication is about women caretakers who established children's homes right after the war in Poland and then went with the children's homes either to the DP camps in Germany or to France. But they went with their children, and actually each of these groups the caretaker was with the children until they reached Eretz Israel, or at least some of them.
Right.
So what we see is that there is organization by people who have suffered like the children. Right. And they want to give the children a future, and the future, they understand, is not in Europe.
So it's an autonomous organization as well as the actions of the relief agencies.
Yes.
I mean, that is even perhaps more important and more impactful because it comes from within the community.
Yeah, this is very interesting because we organized a workshop. I was a part of a group organizing a workshop in Germany this year in Dachau. It was about children after the war, not only Jews, but DPs, children who were victims of Germans. One of the big historians who spoke that said, look, we can't tell the truth that the rehabilitation of Jewish children succeeded because of the national issue. They had something to live for. This was not, you take a child from Senegal, you bring him to the house of a celebrity in Hollywood. You say, you are now someone new, you are someone else, you have to adapt yourself to a new society. You are no more. You have a new set of beliefs and forms. Now, when you look at Jewish children, first their staff was suffering just like them, and they had nowhere to go just like the children, and they could offer the children a future. And that future was not coming to a country with excellent relief work. It's being a part of building the country. What you can see very nicely in several of these women, the way they talk with the children about how they will establish a kibbutz. And they play what we would call today guided imagination. They would play, we are now in our kibbutz, and it's dusk, and Shmuel is bringing the sheep back from the grazing, and we are all sitting on the dining room. And so they would play, they would dream, they had something to dream. And when they came to Eretz Yisrael, they were exactly in the age of really building the state. We have to remember, and this is, I will not talk about today, but this is for maybe another time, that survivors are not guests in Israeli society. Survivors are Israeli society. They build the state.
Yeah.
These young people came here and they became the generation who built the country. So they had something to wake up for in the morning. They had something to wish for. If you were a Polish child in Polish education, you only had bitterness because you lost...
Unless you were a communist.
No, I mean, if you were the one who didn't want to go back, the immigrants,
okay.
and your father served in the British Army, and you didn't want to go back, you wanted to go back to another Poland. That Poland was not waiting for you, and you would not go there. So your future is bleak. Even if you would be taken to the U.S. and given excellent education.
Other than the ideological aspect that obviously was very powerful and it worked, it was a very powerful recruitment mechanism for the remaining Jews in Europe who, by and large, weren't Zionists before the war. But I want to ask you, apart from that, about the effort to give them psychological treatment.
No, there's no psychologists around. One of the caretakers who went on to be in touch with the children so long that they celebrated her 19th birthday a few years ago, and then she died, Chasia Bielska, she writes, we didn't know what to do with the children. We had no education. No one knew, but no one else knew either. We knew better than the others because we were working day to day with the children. So psychologically, we find very few traces of psychological. There weren't enough psychologists around. In hard cases, in DP camps, people would use German child psychologists, which was really...
Yeah. No, but the interesting thing that just like, the ideological aspect that was really ad hoc and on the grassroots level, it might have been the same with psychology.
Yeah, so
the people who were there, the adults, gave the children unprofessional psychological support.
This is true. What we see is less professional involvement. What we do see is a lot of thought-out work. If we talk again about those women caretakers, some of whom studied psychology, education, somewhat, they understand that children need a home, that they need security, that they need food on the table. For example, this is something which is very important. All of them separately developed this idea that there always has to be food on the table, always bread on the table. When a big bowl of bread, when it finishes, everyone can take as much as he wants. Now, I can tell you that my daughter ran a foster home also. We had our own foster kids, but our daughter ran a foster home, and she didn't read all my research. But the first thing she did when she started working in the foster home was to start cooking in the home, that there'll be smell with the children, and the fridge was always open, and there was bread all the time on the table. And this is today. So people understood this in Yana food security. The other thing these caretakers understood was the need for patience. There were major identity issues. We have to remember many of the children survived in hiding in monasteries. We have this issue of the monastery girls, Jewish girls in Zionist children's homes who were going around with big crosses and having icons on the wall. And they understood you need patience. And every one of them, again, separately, talks about this. Another thing they talk about is building a surrogate family. The idea that we have no parents. None of us. So they lost their parents, the caretakers, and so did the children. So we should be each other's family. Like the older children should be like older brothers. And every one of them talks about this. Now, what we're talking about in all this issue is about the micro. Actually, there's the micro and the micro. The micro is that caretaker on the ground in the children's homes. And this is something that has academically less been researched. But what we do see that there is a start of research on the UNRWA child search teams or child branch or child tracing branch, depends on the period exactly. These people understand that you need policies to work with children. For example, once they decide that they will let the children work with their national teams, national guides or counselors, they open training programs for these youth leaders, the madrichim. They open programs for them because they understand that these are the guys who have the ear of the children, and they are not going to fight it. They are not going to bring professional staff from the States. They are going to train them, and there's a very interesting point here that everyone quotes in all the books on this issue. People quote a document that says, someone says, I went to this Aschau camps, the Kinderlager, and I explained to the youth leaders what I'm going to do, and that I'm going to teach them pedagogy and etc. And they say, one of them said, we don't need pedagogy, we need ideology. Mm-hmm. Now, everyone quotes this, but the problem is no one quotes the rest of the document, which says, after this altercation, they started taking the course. So, I mean, it's true that people said so many things, but in the end, they cooperated in getting guidance from the UNRWA.
Uh-huh. And I want to ask you to go back maybe to the therapeutic element here. Would you say that the testimonies was part of that, collecting testimonies?
It's interesting to see that the people who start taking testimonies from children are teachers, educators. And they are certainly looking at the therapeutic part of this. Not everyone is talking about it, but we have, if you would have talked about adult testimonies, I would have also said that one of the first collectors of adult testimonies also talks about it. But let's say with adults, they knew they were looking for facts or whatever people thought they should look in testimony. But with the children, they understood that it has a role, that you can use the testimonies, that speaking is good. Chasia Bielska, who took her kids' testimonies when they were incarcerated in the Cyprus detention camp by the British on the way to Eretz Yisrael. They were on a illegal immigrant ship. They were caught. They were brought to a camp with soldiers with bayonets on the rifles around. And she said this was the time to take the stories. And she said it was a 2-week process. And the children were comparing and crying. She said it's like the pus coming out of the wounds. And the result was a notebook of their stories. Now, I must say that we've been tracing children's testimonies for a long time, and we were looking for people whose testimonies we have to talk with them about the testimony they gave once, and these people don't remember giving testimony. So we can't actually prove that the child who was interviewed had it better than the child who was not. Yep. We can't say that. But it is true that educators all around understood the importance of getting the children's stories, and that we're not looking for dates.
The interesting thing about it for me as a lay observer is that it proves that there was really no conspiracy of silence around it.
All my research is about this. I think we call this today the myth of silence. If you look at the whole generation of the research done in the last 10 years on Israel, there's my book on the birth and evolution of Holocaust research, which is both in Hebrew and English. There's a book by Sharon Geva on the way women survivors appeared in Israeli press, which was very good if you look at the right press, like Laisha, instead of looking at others.
Yeah. Women's magazines.
And you have, in women's magazines, for example, you have a new PhD by Gali Drucker-Baum, who shows that Yiddish speakers spoke about the Holocaust all the time in a very strong Yiddish press that existed in Israel of the 50s. That was a budding press. I mean, we're talking about having massive circulation and massive relations. So actually, people were speaking.
Yep. Interesting. Well, the thing about this specific historical research is that it perhaps has repercussions for today's reality, where we see also 70 years on, but very few things have changed. We see millions of child refugees around the world. What do you think your study offers or could offer to the relief agencies that work today?
This is a major issue for me and for some of my friends all over. We have very few historians of children after the war. We're talking about you need two hands and maybe a third one to count the people who are doing research on the aftermath of the war and children in the aftermath of the war. We are all really burning with this idea that we have a lot to tell the people who work today. Now, for this, we attend conferences with the UN. We try. We were working with one UN agency. I will not say its name because they're really nice to us. And we said, invite historians to the UN building to work with your staff to tell you what was done in similar situations for 50, 70 years ago. The bottom line was that they can't convince their friends that there's something to be learned from something that happened so long ago.
You beg to differ.
We beg to differ, and we are now organizing the same group. We are trying to convince the Europeans, and maybe we are succeeding to write. We want to write a policy paper for European decision makers and people on the ground working in the field, showing in what ways the problems they address were done years ago. We are not telling them this is how you have to do it because we are not the ones who are in the field, but we are saying that, look, you didn't invent the wheel. These problems existed and people gave a lot of thought and made a lot of mistakes already.
Mm-hmm. And so what are really the outstanding mistakes that people made then that are being repeated today?
I find it hard to talk about mistakes because I'm really busy to talk about the nice things. Okay. Actually, I think
but really, what do you think was done 70 years ago in the wake of the Second World War that is not done today or not done enough?
Okay, so I think one thing is relating to the culture and identity of the children. I mean, you're taking a new million of refugees in Germany. I understand why the Germans wanted to be Germans as fast as possible. I can understand this. On the other hand, there's no way you can really build a healthy, involved person without relating to his ethnic identity. Not hiding it, not giving him something global, but relating. This is one thing. Another thing, the technical things. I heard a number that our German colleagues talked about, thousands of children who were lost to the German system. Now, if you look at the post-war world in Europe, we have documentation of every child who moved in the system. We have this documentation today. It's fascinating stuff. We have personal files. Each child, the day he started, it was documented on the first day, and we can trace them, how they were moved.
Moving all around Europe.
And we did some project about a notebook written in 1945, and we just published it in English in the Journal of East European Jewish Affairs. It has more than 40 children's testimonies in it. We looked for the children, and we traced them to the days they asked for reparations. Some of them we could trace because
years later,
there's a paper trail, and children did not get lost in the system. There's the issue of adoption. We have a celebrity adoption, very strong today. I feel you can see I have a problem with this.
Yeah, but there are not very many.
No, but the whole idea of adopting a poor, forlorn child from wherever. Post-war Europe, a lot of people wanted to adopt children. People from the Allied armies and the aid agencies, military government, and people became aware that this is a problem, and there's a massive discussion on adoption of refugee children, which was a very good discussion. Also,
what was the alternative for them to
stay in children's homes, grow up as people belonging to their people,
right,
and having a chance
even as orphans.
Even as orphans. Look, this is also always a major problem when you see it in the Jewish context. When you take a child from the Polish family, you rescued him, and then you take him back to the Jewish people, the option you give him is an orphanage.
No, that's what I'm saying. So
there is.
So it's.
But you don't know.
You're still saying that it's preferable to.
Maybe as a family. Maybe we're talking post-war. That's like today. We're talking today. I saw the numbers on the immigration map. 4.5 million refugees from Syria are moving around the world. Now, can you be sure that he has no parents?
Right.
And you can't. And there were stories in Israel too, but there were people whose name was changed during immigration, children, and then the parents came in, couldn't find them. They were adopted in the meanwhile. There's fascinating, tragic stories around this.
So today, among the many children refugees in the world, you feel that there isn't enough documentation, and many of them get lost.
So we heard from our European colleagues. I'm saying that generally, the idea of how to run a children's homes, the idea of oversight over children's institutions, the UNRWA was doing this a long time ago, and also national institutions were working according to its guidelines. So I think it is important to see how that was done. This is in the macro level, in the organization, institutional level, and the personal level. All this work done in children's homes. Unfortunately, we Jews and Israelis are very good. We had a very strong experience after the war with this. And there is research coming out now, sometimes tragic, sometimes good, but this is something we can give to the world. I really feel it very strongly.
Okay, so to all you listeners at the UN headquarters and in Brussels, take heed and follow up on Boaz Cohen's very valuable work. He's a historian, the chair of the Holocaust Studies Program at the Western Galilee College, and the author of several books, including most recently Was Their Voice Heard? Early Holocaust Testimonies of Child Survivors. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Gilad.
And also big thanks to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast and many more where it came from, just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at Gilad_Halpern. I tweet mainly about the review, and do not hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
קמתי בבוקר, זה היה די מצחיק. לא זיהיתי את עצמי, משתקף בראי. צחצחתי שיניים עם עיניים עצומות, ולא ידעתי איזה יום היום.